The cold steel of the cot dug into Don Alessandro Rossi's back as the metallic shriek of the prison alarm sliced through the pre-dawn silence. His last day. The words echoed, cold and final, in a small, sterile cell. He didn't flinch, didn't stir, merely opened his eyes to the gray light filtering through the high, barred window. A guard slid a tray through the slot, a meager last fare, a cold, congealed scramble of eggs, and some kind of palate sausage, a stark contrast to the opulent feasts Alessandro Rossi, Don Rossi, had once commanded. He didn't even glance at it, the very sight of the offering a final, pathetic insult. His gaze, sharp and unwavering despite the encroaching shadows of his final hours, remained fixed on the high, barred window where the first faint blush of a miserable dawn began to stain the oppressive gray sky. The metallic shriek of the prison alarm had pierced the pre-dawn silence just moments before, a sound he had come to associate with the sterile, relentless march of time within these walls, a march that now, for him, reached its inevitable end. He didn't flinch, didn't stir, merely opened his eyes to the meager light, filtering through the fortified glass, a light that promised nothing but the cold reality of the day. The guard, a young man named Marco with eyes that still held a flicker of humanity, cleared his throat from outside the cell. Don Rossi, your last meal. Alessandro didn't turn, his voice, when it came, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with an ancient weariness, yet also with an unsettling steadiness. Take it away. Just black coffee. No sugar. No. Milk. And make it quick. Marco hesitated, a flicker of surprise in his gaze. Most condemned men, he knew, either devoured their last meal in a desperate act of defiance against the void or refused it outright, their stomachs too twisted with fear to stomach anything. A specific request, delivered with such quiet authority, was rare. As you wish, Don Rossi. The tray was withdrawn, the slot clanging shut with a dull finality that seemed to echo the closing chapters of Alessandro's life. He rose from the cot, the cold steel having long ceased to bother him, and walked to the small, chipped ceramic sink. He splashed water on his face, the icy shock a temporary reprieve from the dull throb behind his eyes, a sensation he had come to crave in the monotonous purgatory of his imprisonment. He studied his reflection in the tarnished metal surface above the sink, a face etched with the ruthless wisdom of a lifetime spent navigating treachery and power, lines of command, deeply carved around eyes that had witnessed unspeakable acts, both given and received. There was no fear there, only a profound, almost terrifying calm. It was the face of a man who had made peace with his demons, or perhaps had simply absorbed them into his very soul. Minutes later, the slot rattled open again, and a steaming mug of coffee, black as pitch, slid through. The rich, bitter aroma filled the small cell, a small luxury in a world stripped bare of all comfort. He took a long, slow sip, the heat scalding his tongue, the caffeine a welcome jolt to his system. He leaned against the cold, concrete wall, watching the subtle ballet of the prison's awakening. The distant clanging of gates, the muffled shouts of guards, the rhythmic crunch of boots on concrete in the corridors outside, all merged into a symphony of institutional control, a brutal, efficient machine, grinding towards its inevitable purpose. He observed it all, not with resentment, but with an almost academic detachment, as if studying the mechanics of his own demise, a detached observer in the final act of his own tragic opera. The guards changed shifts, their faces grim, their movements practiced, each one meticulously avoiding his direct gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the chilling finality that pervaded his cell. He wondered if they saw a monster, a legend, or just another condemned man. He suspected, in their hardened eyes, he was all three, and none of them truly understood the man behind the myth. The coffee, bitter and strong, grounded him, focusing his thoughts, sharpening his senses for what was to come. It was the only ritual he allowed himself. Now, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of his final hours. The heavy clang of the cell door being unbarred jolted him, not with fear, but with a familiar, almost welcome sense of urgency. Padre Antonio, his face a canvas of gentle sorrow and unwavering duty, stood in the doorway, a well-worn Bible clutched in his trembling hands. The priest was an old man, his hair a thin halo of white, his eyes perpetually shadowed with the weight of the confessions he had heard, the souls he had tried to guide. He stepped into the cell, the air instantly thicker with the scent of old incense and unspoken prayers. Alessandro turned from the window, his gaze meeting the Padre's with an unsettling directness. No, Padre. It has been drawing near for a long time. There was no bitterness in his tone, no lament, just a simple, unadorned statement of fact. Padre Antonio nodded, his eyes filled with a profound sadness that seemed to ache for the soul. Standing before him, "Have you found peace, my son? Have you made your peace with God? With those you have wronged?" His voice trailed off, careful not to accuse, only to offer the path to redemption. He extended his hand, the Bible resting gently in his palm, a silent invitation to absolution. Alessandro merely inclined his head, a gesture that could be interpreted as acceptance, or perhaps simply a respectful acknowledgement of the ritual. Peace, Padre, is a luxury few of us are truly afforded. But understanding I have found. He did not reach for the Bible, nor did he offer confession. His sins, he knew, were too numerous, too deeply ingrained to be washed away by a few hurried prayers in his final moments. His absolution, if it was to come, would have to be forged in a different kind of fire. He knew the Padre meant well, a kind, good man trapped in a world that often made no sense, a world he himself had helped to corrupt. But the comfort Padre Antonio offered was not the comfort Alessandro sought. He had faced down death too many times, had delivered it too often to be swayed by platitudes now. He simply watched the priest, a faint, almost imperceptible curve playing at the corner of his mouth, a ghost of a smile that was gone before it could fully form. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths and the inevitability of the moment. Padre Antonio, seeing the impenetrable resolve in the man's eyes, sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that spoke of resignation. He knew no words could truly penetrate the hardened shell of Don Rossi. He offered a short, heartfelt prayer, his voice a balm against the harshness of the cell, invoking blessings and mercy, even for a soul as burdened as Alessandro's. Alessandro listened, his eyes closed for a brief moment, not in prayer, but perhaps in contemplation of the pure, unyielding faith of the man before him. When the prayer concluded, he opened his eyes, his gaze once again steady, unflinching. "Thank you, Padre," he said, the words quiet but sincere, "for your time, for your kindness." Padre Antonio nodded, his eyes glistening. "May God have mercy on your soul, my son." He turned, his movements slow and heavy, and exited the cell, the door clanging shut behind him, the sound echoing through the silence like a final toll. Almost immediately, the heavy steel door to the corridor beyond swung open, and 3 guards entered, their faces grim, their movements precise and practiced. They were led by Captain Valerio, a man whose face was a mask of cold professionalism, his eyes betraying nothing. Each step they took into the cell was measured, each action imbued with a morbid solemnity that hung in the air, like a shroud. This was the protocol, the final, dehumanizing ritual before the ultimate act. "Sua ora shigo, Don Rossi," Captain Valerio stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a pronouncement rather than a warning. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, severing the last fragile threads of hope, confirming the absolute finality of the situation. Alessandro met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his own eyes. He pushed himself off the wall, his posture ramrod straight, his shoulders broad, still carrying the phantom weight of an empire. "I know," he responded, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the sterile silence of the cell, a voice that had commanded armies of men, a voice that had struck fear into the hearts of many. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his chest expanding with an almost defiant vitality. But not without a last word. The guards exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Captain Valerio's brow furrowed, a flicker of surprise breaking through his carefully constructed mask of indifference. Such requests were not uncommon, but the way Don Rossi delivered it, the unwavering confidence in his tone, suggested something more than a mere statement of regret or defiance. It hinted at a final play, an unexpected twist in a narrative that everyone believed was already written. The air in the cell, already thick with tension, suddenly crackled with an unspoken question, a sudden, jarring shift in the predictable rhythm of the execution protocol. Alessandro Rossi, the legendary Don, stood before them, resolute, unbowed, and utterly in control, even in the face of his own annihilation. He took another measured breath, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled guards, then resting on Captain Valerio. A faint, almost imperceptible glint in his dark eyes, a spark of something they couldn't quite decipher. Then, with a voice that resonated with an unshakable authority, a voice that had once shaped destinies and commanded loyalties, he made his final request, a plea so utterly unexpected, so deeply personal, that it momentarily stunned everyone in the room into a shocked, bewildered silence. The words hung, suspended, an almost absurd counterpoint to the grim reality of the execution chamber. Captain Valerio's jaw, already tight, clenched further, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He blinked once, twice, as if to clear a sudden fog from his vision, struggling to reconcile the notorious Mafia boss, the architect of countless ruthless schemes, with a request so domestic, so mundane. A maid? The thought was so preposterous, so entirely out of character for the man before him, that, for a split second, Valerio wondered if he had misheard, if the Don was mocking them, playing some final, twisted game. The other guards, uniformed and stoic just moments before, shifted, uneasily, their eyes darting between Valerio and Rossi, a silent communication of bewilderment passing between them. A low murmur rippled through the small group, a mixture of confusion and open incredulity. "That is absurd." Valerio finally managed, his voice sharper than he intended, the carefully cultivated calm of his demeanor cracking under the strain of the unexpected. He stepped forward, his boots echoing against the concrete floor, a clear challenge in his posture. "Why her? There must be a manipulation here, a final ploy to buy time, to escape. This is not some sentimental Last Supper. Rossi, this is your execution." His words, though firm, carried an underlying current of frustration, a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had suddenly veered wildly off script. The very idea of a maid being significant to a man like Alessandro Rossi was almost insulting, an affront to the magnitude of his crimes, to the meticulous preparations for this very moment. It felt like a deliberate act of subversion, a mockery of the justice system. Alessandro remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, meeting Valerio's anger with an almost unsettling placidity. There was no defiance in his eyes, no overt challenge, merely a profound, almost weary determination. It was a stillness that spoke volumes, a quiet refusal to be rattled, a silent assertion of his unassailable right to this one final request. The air grew impossibly thick, charged with the unspoken tension between the two men, one fueled by indignation and duty, the other by something far more enigmatic, something that seemed to hint at a secret, a profound connection that defied logic and expectation. Valerio's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of protocols, security risks, and a sheer audacity of the request. "We cannot accommodate this," he stated, his voice now colder, more authoritative, attempting to reassert the rigid boundaries of their duty. "It's a breach of protocol, a security risk. Who is this woman? We have no information on her, no background check, no security clearance. For all we know, she could be an accomplice, a plant, another piece in one of your elaborate schemes. This is a secure facility, Don Rossi. We cannot simply bring an unknown civilian in here, hours before an execution. It's preposterous." He gestured vaguely around the sterile cell, as if the very walls could attest to the impossibility of such a request. The guards nodded in agreement, their faces grim, relieved that their captain was articulating their own fears and suspicions. The thought of a last-minute disruption, a sudden attack, a desperate attempt at escape, was a very real and terrifying possibility with a man like Rossi. Every contingency had been planned for, every scenario rehearsed, but a former maid? That was one they had never considered. "There are no schemes left for me, Captain," Alessandro replied, his voice still low, almost conversational, yet possessing an undeniable edge of finality. "My time is measured in hours, not decades. I'm not seeking to escape. I'm merely asking for a moment, a final moment." He paused, his dark eyes seeming to bore into Valerio's, searching for something, a flicker of understanding, a hint of human compassion beneath the uniform. "Sophia Moretti. She was with my family for nearly 20 years. She raised my children as if they were her own. She saw me at my weakest, Captain. She saw me when no one else dared." There was a subtle shift in his tone then, a faint tremor that was barely perceptible, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. It was a raw, unexpected admission, a chink in the formidable armor of the Mafia Don, and it resonated through the silent cell, momentarily disarming Valerio, planting a seed of doubt in his rigid convictions. The sheer personal nature of the plea, the uncharacteristic glimpse into a softer side of the ruthless boss, was unsettling. It didn't fit the narrative. Valerio hesitated, his eyes narrowing, dissecting Alessandro's face for any sign of deceit, any tell that would betray a hidden agenda. He had spent years studying men like Rossi, learning to read the subtle nuances of their manipulation, the intricate layers of their lies. But in this moment there was a stark sincerity in the Don's gaze, a quiet desperation that was almost unnerving. It was the look of a man stripped bare, facing the ultimate end, clinging to a singular, profound desire. Still, suspicion gnawed at him. Mafia bosses did not show vulnerability without reason. This had to be a distraction, a cleverly disguised ploy. Alessandro offered no argument, no further plea, no rising inflection of anger or frustration. He simply stood there, a granite statue of resolve, his silence more potent than any shouted demand. He watched Valerio, his dark eyes unblinking, conveying an unshakable conviction that this, his final wish, was non-negotiable, an intrinsic right that even the state could not deny him. It was a silent battle of wills, and in that moment, despite his chains and the impending doom, Alessandro Rossi held an unexpected upper hand. His impassiveness was a shield, a weapon, a testament to a lifetime of controlling every situation, even his own demise. He had always played the long game, even when the clock was running out. Valerio felt a cold, not tightening in his stomach. He was caught between his duty to adhere to procedure and a growing, uncomfortable sense that dismissing this request outright, without understanding its true purpose, might be a graver mistake. He knew Rossi. He knew the man never did anything without a reason, without a deeper calculation. What if this maid was not just a maid? What if she held a secret, a piece of information, a message meant for someone on the outside? A final instruction, a posthumous command, a last act of vengeance from beyond the grave. The thought sent a chill down his spine. The Mafia operated in shadows, in whispers, in codes. This seemingly innocuous request could be the most dangerous move of all. To deny it completely might be to miss a crucial opportunity, to leave a dangerous loose end untied. He bit back a frustrated groan. The complications were endless, but the alternative, the nagging, feeling that he was underestimating Rossi, that he was walking into a trap by not granting the request, was equally unsettling. A direct confrontation, a refusal, might simply force Rossi to act in a different, perhaps more unpredictable way. He had to play this carefully. He had to understand. If there was a hidden motive, a final card, he needed to see it, to uncover it before it was too late. He couldn't afford to be outmaneuvered in these final hours, not by a man already condemned. The reputation of the state, of his unit, was at stake. Valerio let out a slow, deliberate breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. He still believed it was a manipulation, a final, desperate attempt at something. But what if the manipulation lay in refusing the request? What if the Don wanted them to say no, to provoke a reaction, to set in motion another layer of his intricate planning? This was the game Rossi played, a psychological warfare that continued even to the brink of the grave. He looked at the Don again, at the quiet, unyielding strength in his eyes, and a decision, heavy with reluctant acceptance, began to form in his mind. He would grant the request, but he would do so on his own terms, with every precaution imaginable, turning the Don's gambit into his own investigative opportunity. He would peel back the layers of this seemingly innocent plea, uncover the truth lurking beneath, and ensure that Alessandro Rossi's last act was not one of defiance, but of ultimate, undeniable defeat. "All right," Valerio said, the word emerging from his lips with a forced calm, a profound reluctance. That was palpable in the confined space. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his men, a silent command for them to prepare. Find Sofia Moretti, his former maid. Now, the order hung in the air, a jarring shift in the relentless march towards execution, an unexpected detour into the unknown, driven by the quiet, unsettling will of a man who, even in chains, refused to relinquish control. Valerio knew he was stepping into a meticulously crafted trap, a final maze designed by the Don, but he also knew he had no choice but to enter too, navigate its twists and turns, and to finally, irrevocably, expose the last secrets of Alessandro Rossi. Before the sun rose, the cold steel of the sink bit into Sofia Moretti's fingertips, a familiar chill that grounded her. A small, tangible reality in a world she often felt was slipping through her grasp. The morning sun, a rare, pale visitor in her cramped kitchen, sliced through the grimy window pane, illuminating dust. Motes dancing in the stale air and highlighting the chipped paint on the walls. She scrubbed the last of the breakfast dishes, a simple plate, a solitary mug, and a fork, the rhythmic scrape of the sponge. Against ceramic, a monotonous soundtrack to her quiet existence. Every day began this way, a meticulous ritual of order amidst the chaos of memories she tried so desperately to keep at bay. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress of routine, built brick by brick with long hours at the local bakery, the smell of warm bread a comforting shield against the chill that sometimes seeped into her soul. By night, she cleaned offices, the silent hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of industrial cleaner, another layer of insulation. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, were now calloused, bearing the marks of honest, relentless labor. They were the hands of a woman who had worked herself to exhaustion, not out of greed, but out of a profound need for forgetfulness, for the kind of weariness that chased away nightmares and left no room for the ghosts of a past she wished had never been hers. She hummed a tuneless melody, a fragment of an old Italian folk song her nonna used to sing, as she dried her hands on a threadbare towel. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, was pulled back in a severe bun, framing a face that was still beautiful, though etched with lines of worry and a weariness that went far deeper than physical fatigue. Her eyes, the color of rich espresso, held a perpetual shadow, a quiet sadness that even her brightest smiles could not entirely dispel. She moved with a practiced grace, born of years spent on her feet, a silent ballet of survival. The small apartment, a single room with a partition for a makeshift bedroom, was sparse but immaculately kept. Every item had its place, a testament to her need for control for an ordered universe after living in one where control had been a cruel illusion. A sharp, insistent knock rattled the flimsy door, pulling her abruptly from her thoughts. It was too early for the landlady, too late for her neighbor. Her heart gave a small, unwelcome lurch, a phantom echo of anxieties she'd long buried. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, a strange premonition prickling at the back of her neck. Another knock, louder this time, more authoritative. She swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry, and slowly, cautiously, she peered through the peephole. A uniformed officer stood on her doorstep, his expression grave, his presence an unwelcome intrusion into her carefully curated solitude. He held a folded document in his hand, an official seal glinting ominously in the morning light. A cold dread seeped into her bones, familiar and unwelcome. She had always known this day might come, a quiet, lingering fear that had shadowed her for years, a whisper in the dark that someday the past would catch up. She opened the door just enough to peer out, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Can I help you, officer?" The man's eyes, cold and dispassionate, scanned her face, as if searching for something, a flicker of recognition, a sign of guilt. "Sophia Moretti?" he asked, his voice low and formal. She nodded, clutching the doorframe, her knuckles white. "Yes, that's me." He held out the document, a subpoena, its official weight seeming to press down on her. "I have an order for you to appear. The Don Alessandro Rossi, he has to see you. He will be executed today." The words hung in the air, shattering the fragile peace of her morning, splintering it into 1,000 shards of terror and disbelief. Alessandro. The name ripped from her throat, a raw, strangled sound she hadn't realized she was capable of making. It tasted like ash, like old blood, like everything she had fought so hard to bury. The small, quiet room seemed to tilt, the sparse furniture blurring at the edges. Her breath hitched, caught somewhere deep in her chest, refusing to release. She felt a sudden, dizzying wave of nausea, the room spinning around her. It couldn't be. Not him. Not again. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp, a silent scream that threatened to tear its way out of her. The officer's words, "executed today," echoed in her ears, a morbid drumbeat accompanying the violent pounding of her own heart. The image of Alessandro Rossi, dark, commanding, dangerous, flashed behind her eyes, not as the condemned man he now was, but as the formidable figure who had once loomed so large over her existence. A shiver, cold and bone-deep, traced a path down her spine. The old trauma, dormant for so long, stirred within her, a sleeping serpent roused by the sound of its master's name. Memories, sharp and unwelcome, assaulted her, the hushed opulent halls of his villa, the heavy scent of cigars and expensive wine, the silent, watchful men who moved like shadows, and always, always his eyes, dark and piercing, missing nothing. "No, no, I can't." Her voice was barely a whisper, a plea torn from the depths of her fear. She shook her head, a violent, desperate refusal. Please don't ask me to. Her hands began to tremble. Uncontrollably, a tremor that started in her fingertips and spread rapidly through her arms, up to her shoulders. She felt cold, then hot, a sudden clammy sweat breaking out on her forehead. The paper, still clutched by the officer, seemed to pulse with an unholy light, a gateway back into the very nightmare she had meticulously escaped. She had fled that life, left everything behind, changed cities, changed names, all to be free of the suffocating grip of the Don and his world. And now on the precipice of his death, he was reaching for her again, pulling her back into the abyss. Legally required. The words felt like chains binding her, dragging her back to a past she had painstakingly severed herself from. Her mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of terror and confusion. Why? Why now? What could he possibly want from her? After all these years, a part of her, a raw, wounded part, wanted nothing more than to slam the door shut, to barricade herself in her small apartment, to pretend this horrifying summons had never arrived, to disappear again, further, deeper, to somewhere the Don's dying wish could not reach her. The thought of facing him, of being in the same room, of meeting those dark, knowing eyes one last time, filled her with a profound, primal dread. It felt like walking into a cage she had spent years clawing her way out of. But beneath this suffocating blanket of fear, a tiny, insidious spark flickered. Curiosity, a morbid, dangerous curiosity. What secret could he possibly hold that warranted this final, desperate request? What loose end was he trying to tie, or perhaps untie, with his final breaths? Had he truly changed? Was there something he needed to confess, something he needed to atone for? Or was this another, one of his games, a final, twisted manipulation from beyond the grave? The questions swirled in her mind, a relentless tide eroding the walls of her refusal. She hated him, hated what he represented, hated the shadows he had cast over her life. But a small, rebellious voice whispered that this might be her only chance for answers, for closure, for a peace that had eluded her for far too long. To finally understand, to finally be free. Her gaze drifted from the officer's impassive face to the subpoena in his hand, then back to the chipped paint on her doorframe. A stark contrast between her humble reality and the terrifying world that now demanded her presence. She felt caught, suspended between an unbearable past and an uncertain future, the weight of both pressing down on her. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic and the frantic rhythm of her own breathing. Her hands were still, shaking, but a strange resolve, cold and brittle, began to form within her. It wasn't courage, not exactly. It was more like the grim determination of someone walking into a storm they knew they couldn't outrun. She had to know. She had to face him one last time, if only to finally lay the ghost of Alessandro Rossi to rest, once and for all. A sigh, heavy and laden with years of unspoken pain, escaped her lips. It was a surrender, not to the officer, but to the inexplicable force that now pulled her towards the unknown, towards the man who had cast such a long shadow over her life. All right, she whispered, the word barely audible, a fragile thread snapping in the quiet morning air. Her voice was raspy, strained, as if each syllable was carved from stone. I'll go. The decision, once uttered, felt strangely immutable, a pathway laid out before her, dark and fraught with peril, yet undeniably her own. The officer nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, perhaps surprise, or perhaps just the cold satisfaction of a duty discharged. He handed her the subpoena, its official weight now a physical burden in her trembling hand, and gave her instructions for the prison. Sophia looked at the official document, then at her humble, carefully ordered apartment, and knew, with a chilling certainty, that this single, reluctant agreement had just sealed her fate setting her on a collision course with a reunion that would not just change everything, but shatter the very foundations of her world. The cold morning air bit at Sophia's exposed skin as she stepped from the relative warmth of her apartment entryway, the subpoena still clutched in her hand. A dark, unmarked sedan, unmistakably. A police vehicle despite its subtle appearance, idled at the curb. Its engine humble low, predatory. Purr. The same officer who had delivered the summons now stood beside the open rear passenger door, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He didn't offer a smile, or even a nod, just a stoic gesture towards the car's interior. It felt less like an invitation and more like an imperative. With a final, lingering glance at her small, orderly world, a world she had so carefully constructed to distance herself from the chaos of her past, Sophia slid onto the stiff, unforgiving seat. The door closed with a muted, yet utterly final, thud, severing her connection to everything familiar, everything safe. The silence that immediately descended within the vehicle was thick, suffocating. It wasn't an empty silence, but one pregnant with unspoken questions, with the weight of her past and the terrifying uncertainty of her immediate future. The officer, now behind the wheel, drove with a practiced, almost clinical efficiency. He didn't speak, didn't glance in the rearview mirror, his profile as unreadable as the tinted glass that now separated Sophia from the outside world. The city, streets, usually bustling with the morning rush, seemed to hold their breath as they passed. Familiar. Landmarks blurred into an indistinct canvas, receding rapidly as the car picked up speed, propelling her further and further from her sanctuary. The sterile scent of recycled air and old upholstery filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the lingering aroma of coffee and toast from her untouched breakfast. Her hands, still trembling slightly, rested in her lap, fingers intertwining, then separating a nervous dance reflecting the tumultuous storm brewing within her. As the cityscape gave way to the sprawling, less defined outskirts, her mind, no longer anchored by present surroundings, began to drift, pulled inexorably back through the corridors of time. Fragmented images, like old, faded photographs, flickered behind her eyes. How many years has it been? She wondered, the unspoken question a whisper in the echoing chambers of her memory. It felt like a lifetime, an eternity separating the Sophia who now sat captive in this car from the young, naive maid who had once moved through the opulent halls of Alessandro Rossi's villa. He was a monster, yes, she conceded, the undeniable truth a cold knot in her stomach, a fact etched into the very fabric of her being. His name alone conjured images of ruthless power, of whispers carried on the wind, of an empire built on fear and intimidation. But then another image intruded, softer, more complex, entirely unwelcome in its unexpected warmth. But he was also the father of the children I loved, she mused, the contradiction a sharp, painful jab. She remembered the way his eyes, usually hard and impenetrable, would soften almost imperceptibly when he watched his son, Marco, chase a ball across the manicured lawn. The rare, almost shy smile he'd offer his daughter, Isabella, when she presented him with a crayon drawing, a splash of vibrant, innocent color in his otherwise monochrome world. Sophia had seen him only a handful of times, stroke Isabella's hair with a tenderness that seemed utterly incongruous with the man who commanded such terrifying loyalty and fear. She recalled a particularly stormy evening, a power outage plunging the vast villa into darkness. Isabella, a tiny bundle of fear, had cried out, and it was Alessandro, not her mother, who had first reached her, scooping her into his arms, murmuring reassurances in a voice softer than Sophia had ever heard. He had held her close, a silent, formidable protector against the unseen terrors of the dark. Those moments were rare, fleeting, glimpses behind the iron curtain of his persona, but they were real. They complicated the narrative, blurring the lines between the cruel Don and the devoted, albeit distant, patriarch. There was also the secret kindness, a subtle, almost imperceptible thread woven into the tapestry of his terrifying reign. Once, when Sophia had fallen ill with a virulent fever, he had sent his personal doctor to her small, modest room in the staff quarters, ensuring she received the best care, not out of magnanimity, she suspected, but out of a pragmatic need to keep his household running. Yet the gesture had resonated. Another time, he had discovered her quietly reading a tattered book of Italian poetry during her break. The next day, a pristine, leather-bound collection of the same poet appeared on her bedside table, left without a word, a silent, anonymous gift. These weren't acts of benevolence, not truly. They were the calculated, almost accidental expressions of a man whose humanity was buried so deep beneath layers of power and brutality that it only surfaced in the most unexpected, often unsettling ways. They were enough, however, to plant a seed of confusion in Sophia's young heart, making him not just a villain, but a labyrinthine figure she could never quite fully comprehend. The terrifying power he wielded, however, was never far from her thoughts. It was an invisible force, a silent hum that permeated every corner of the villa, every conversation, every unspoken glance. She remembered the hushed tones of the other staff, the way their eyes would dart nervously when his name was mentioned, even in his absence. The air around him seemed to crackle with an unspoken threat, a constant reminder of the consequences for disobedience or betrayal. She had witnessed the subtle shifts in demeanor of powerful men who came to consult with him, their initial bravado slowly melting into deferential respect, then thinly veiled fear under his piercing gaze. The way his voice, never raised, could cut through a room like a sharpened blade, leaving silence and compliance in its wake. This was the man who had shaped her adolescence, who had defined the very boundaries of her world. And this was the man she was now being forced to confront, stripped of his empire, his power, facing the ultimate reckoning. The journey continued, the landscape growing increasingly stark, the buildings sparse and utilitarian. The air outside felt heavier, colder, even through the sealed windows. As they rounded a long, winding bend, a formidable silhouette rose against the pale morning sky, the prison. It loomed on the horizon like a monolithic scar on the earth, its gray, unyielding walls reaching upward, crowned with glinting barbed wire that caught the weak sunlight like a malevolent halo. Watchtowers, dark and imposing, stood guard at regular intervals, their vacant eyes scanning the desolate expanse. Sophia felt a cold dread trickle down her spine, a visceral reaction to the sheer enormity of the structure, to the inescapable reality of what lay within. Her breath hitched in her throat, a tight, painful constriction. The car slowed, turning off the main road onto a narrower asphalt track that led directly to the prison's main entrance. Every revolution of the tires felt like a slow, deliberate march towards her own fate. The security was overwhelming, a suffocating embrace of steel and stone. The first checkpoint was a formidable barrier of thick, iron gates, manned by burly guards in dark uniforms, their faces grim, their weapons prominently displayed. The officer rolled down his window, speaking in hushed, official tones, his voice barely audible to Sophia. She watched, mesmerized and terrified as a guard. His eyes, like chips of ice, scrutinized her through the rear window, his gaze lingering for a beat too long, assessing, judging. The gate groaned open, a deep, metallic growl that echoed ominously, swallowing them whole. They proceeded into a sterile, concrete no-man's land, another set of gates looming ahead. This ritual repeated itself, gate after gate, barrier after barrier, each one a progressively tighter squeeze, each one reinforcing the absolute finality of her journey. Each clang of the closing gates, each heavy thud of the locks engaging, chipped away at her composure, replacing it with a growing, suffocating anxiety. The air became heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the sterile scent of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the distant memory of Rose, gardens, and expensive cigars that had once permeated Alessandro's villa. This was a world of absolute control, of unyielding authority, designed to break spirits and contain the most dangerous of men. And she, Sophia, a simple woman who had spent years trying to erase every trace of that world from her life, was now being pulled back into its darkest heart. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She had fled, had built a new life, brick by painstaking brick, believing she had escaped. She had convinced herself that the shadow of Alessandro Rossi could no longer touch her, that his world, with its violence and its secrets, was forever sealed behind her. Now, here she was returning to the lion's den, not as a defiant survivor, but as a summoned specter, an unwilling participant in his final act. What could he want from me now, at the very end of everything? The question, once a faint whisper, now roared in her mind, a relentless, deafening clamor. He was a condemned man, his power stripped away, his empire crumbling. What possible revelation, what desperate plea, what last, twisted desire could compel him to summon her, of all people, to his deathbed? Was it a confession, a warning, a final act of cruelty? Or was there something else, something she couldn't fathom, something that tied them together in a way she had never understood? The fear was a cold, constricting band around her chest, but beneath it, a tiny, persistent spark of curiosity flickered. A need for closure, perhaps, or a desperate hope for an answer to the questions that had haunted her for so long. The car made its final turn, pulling into a designated parking spot within the inner perimeter, just outside the main administrative building. The engine cut out, plunging them into an even deeper, more profound silence, broken only by the distant, disembodied echoes of the prison itself. A faint shout, the clanking of metal, the indistinguishable murmur of unseen lives. The officer turned to her, his expression still unreadable, but now with a subtle shift, an acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. He merely gestured to the door, a silent command. Sophia swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pushed the door open, the sound surprisingly loud in the oppressive quiet. As she stepped out, her legs feeling strangely heavy, almost alien, the massive, fortified gate behind them began its slow, grinding descent. The sound was immense, a deep, resonant rumble that reverberated through the very ground beneath her feet. With a final, echoing thud, the heavy steel barrier locked into place, sealing her in, marking the undeniable point of no return. The massive, fortified gate behind them began its slow, grinding descent. The sound was immense, a deep, resonant rumble that reverberated through the very ground beneath her feet. With a final, echoing thud, the heavy steel barrier locked into place, sealing her in, marking the undeniable point of no return. Sophia stood for a moment, the chill of the evening air seeping into her bones, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet that had fallen. The officer, a silent sentinel, gestured again this time toward the nondescript door within the administrative building. Each step she took felt deliberate, heavy, as if the very air was thick with unseen forces pulling at her. The building's exterior was cold, utilitarian concrete, devoid of any warmth or welcome, a fitting shell for the lives it contained. Inside, the chill intensified, a perpetual, artificial cold that seemed designed to strip away any lingering hope or comfort. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale, recycled oxygen, a scent that clung to the back of her throat and made her stomach churn. Her Footsteps echoed on the polished linoleum floors, each sound amplified in the cavernous silence of the corridor. It was a labyrinth of harsh fluorescent lights and identical gray doors, a place where individuality was erased and time seemed to stretch into an endless, monotonous drone. Two more guards, their faces impassive masks, fell in a step behind her, their heavy boots thudding a rhythmic counterpoint to her own hesitant pace. She felt their presence like a physical weight, a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation, of the ironclad rules that governed this bleak domain. DeLuca, who had been waiting just inside the entrance, now walked ahead, his posture stiff, his silence more unnerving than any spoken word. He didn't look back, didn't offer a reassuring glance, simply led the way, a grim harbinger of what awaited her. The corridor seemed to stretch on, endlessly, each turn identical to the last, further disorienting her, reinforcing the sense of being trapped within a maze of converging walls. Her mind raced, a jumble of fragmented memories and agonizing questions. Why now? Why Alessandro? What could he possibly want? The old fear, a familiar, unwelcome guest, tightened its grip, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But beneath it, that persistent spark of curiosity, a desperate, almost reckless need for answers, continued to flicker. She found herself scrutinizing every shadow, every closed door, half expecting some dramatic reveal, some grand gesture that would explain the inexplicable. But there was only the cold, hard reality of the prison, the relentless, suffocating quiet. They finally stopped before a heavy steel door, indistinguishable from the others, yet radiating a palpable sense of finality. DeLuca paused, turning to face her for the first time since their arrival. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Concern? Pity? Or perhaps just the weariness of a man perpetually entangled in the dark undercurrents of this world. He said nothing, merely nodded to the guards, who unlatched the heavy bolts with a series of metallic clicks and scrapes that grated on her nerves. The sound was deafening. In the otherwise absolute silence, a stark prelude to the encounter that lay beyond. The door swung inward with a low, mournful creak, revealing a small antechamber, sparsely furnished with a single table and two chairs. Another guard stood there, his back to them, facing a second, heavier door. This was it, the final threshold. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. Her breath hitched, a shallow, desperate gasp. She felt a prickling sensation on her skin, as if every nerve ending had suddenly come alive, hyper-aware of the momentousness of the next few seconds. DeLuca entered the antechamber first, exchanging a brief, hushed word with the guard, who then turned and opened the inner door. As the heavy steel barrier slowly receded, a sliver of light, dim and artificial, escaped into the antechamber, revealing a glimpse of the room beyond. And then she saw him, Alessandro. He was sitting at a small, scarred metal table in the center of the cell, his back to the door, his posture surprisingly straight, almost regal, despite the starkness of his surroundings. The cell itself was bare, just concrete walls, a narrow cot, a toilet, and a small barred window high above. The air was heavy, stagnant, carrying a faint, metallic tang. He didn't turn immediately, as if sensing her presence rather than hearing it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. The sight of him, even from behind, sent a jolt through Sophia, a visceral reaction that bypassed her intellect and went straight to the deepest parts of her memory. The shape of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head. They were achingly familiar, remnants of a past she had tried so desperately to bury. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned. Her breath caught in her throat. He was older, yes, much older than the man she remembered. His once vibrant dark hair was now shot through with streaks of stark white, receding at the temples, lending his face a gaunt, almost skeletal quality. Deep lines like etched canyons crisscrossed his forehead and fanned out from the corners of his eyes, mapping a lifetime of hard-won battles and crushing defeats. His skin, once olive and smooth, was now sallow, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, the shadows beneath his eyes speaking of countless sleepless nights spent in the cold embrace of a prison cell. He wore a simple, gray prison uniform, devoid of any personal touches. Yet somehow, on him, it still managed to convey an aura of authority, a quiet, unyielding power. But it was his eyes. His eyes hadn't changed. They were still the same piercing, intense, almost unervingly intelligent eyes that had haunted her dreams for years. Dark and deep, they held a lifetime of stories of ambition, of cruelty, and, perhaps, now, of a profound, unspoken sorrow. They locked onto hers across the small, sterile space, a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of time, stripping away the years, the pain, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. In that instant, it was as if no time had passed at all, and yet an entire lifetime stood between them. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, a tremor of the old fear, cold and sharp, but also a strange, inexplicable ache, a ghost of the affection she had once held for him, a man who had been both her protector and her tormentor. Unasked questions screamed in her mind, a cacophony of betrayal and longing, of curiosity and dread. What had happened to him? What had happened to them? A heavy silence descended upon the cell, thick and suffocating, absorbing all sound, all movement. It stretched, taut and brittle, between them, filling every corner of the small room, pressing down on Sophia, on Alessandro, on the two guards who stood rigid in the antechamber, and even onto Luca, who remained just inside the doorway, his usual composure cracking under the weight of the unspoken tension. His gaze shifted between Sophia and Alessandro, a subtle furrow in his brow, betraying a flicker of unease, a rare moment of vulnerability in his otherwise impenetrable facade. The silence was more eloquent than any words, a testament to the immense chasm of history, pain, and unresolved emotions that separated the former Mafia boss and his maid. It was the silence of a hundred unspoken regrets, 1,000 bitter truths, 1,000,000 lost opportunities. Sophia felt herself tremble, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her entire body. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to scream, to run, but her voice was caught somewhere deep in her throat, strangled by the sheer intensity of the moment. Her eyes, wide and searching, remained fixed on his, trying to decipher the complex tapestry of emotions swirling within those dark depths. Was it remorse she saw, a glimmer of regret, or was it merely the resignation of a man facing the inevitable, a final, calculated performance? She couldn't tell. Her own emotions were a chaotic storm, battling for dominance, the lingering fear of the man who had controlled so much of her past, the ghost of a tenderness for the man who had once shown her a fleeting kindness and a burning, insatiable need to understand. Alessandro held her gaze, unwavering, for what felt like an eternity. His expression remained unreadable, a carefully constructed mask, yet there was a subtle softening around the edges of his eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as it rested on the table. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lifted his hand and gestured towards a solitary, straight-backed wooden chair positioned directly opposite him, on the other side of the small table. It was a simple, understated gesture, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, an echo of the formality and respect he had once commanded, even in the most brutal of circumstances. "Sophia," he said, his voice a low, raspy murmur, aged and rough, a shadow of the powerful baritone. She remembered. The sound of her name, spoken by him, after so many years, was like a physical blow, reverberating through her very core, sending shivers down her spine. It was a name that had once been whispered with tenderness, then shouted in anger, and now it hung in the air, laden with an unbearable history. She swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. The word, his name, felt heavy on her tongue, charged with meaning, with memory, with all the pain and confusion that had defined her life since their last encounter. It was a challenge, a question, a plea, all rolled into one. "Alessandro," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm, imbued with a newfound strength she hadn't known she possessed. The sound of her own voice, speaking his name, felt like breaking a spell, shattering the suffocating silence, acknowledging the undeniable reality of their shared presence in this desolate cell. He nodded slowly, a slight incline of his head, acknowledging her response, acknowledging her presence. The gesture of invitation still hung in the air, the vacant chair awaiting her decision. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to flee, to turn and run, to escape this suffocating place and the man who embodied so much of her torment. But the chair, the gesture, his eyes, they held her, captive, bound by an invisible tether, an irresistible pull towards the truth, however painful it might be. She had come this far. There was no turning back. With a conscious effort, she forced her trembling legs to move, taking the few steps that separated her from the table, from him. She pulled the chair out, the scrape of metal on concrete, a jarring intrusion in the quiet, and sat down, her gaze never leaving his. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes still fixed on hers, the intensity unwavering. The air in the small cell seemed to crackle with anticipation, a silent current of raw emotion flowing between them. He took a deep, shaky breath, as if steeling himself for an arduous task, and then his gaze dropping briefly to his clasped hands, he began to speak again, his voice still hoarse, but now imbued with a deliberate, almost desperate urgency. He paused, his eyes lifting to hers once more, a profound, almost desperate plea etched into their depths. The quiet intensity of his gaze promised a confession that would unravel the very fabric of her understanding, a revelation that threatened to shatter every preconceived notion she held about her past, about Alessandro, and about the true, brutal nature of the world they had both inhabited. A cold dread, mixed with an almost unbearable anticipation, coiled in Sophia's stomach. He was about to reveal something fundamental, something that would change everything, and there was no escape from the words that were about to spill from his lips. Alessandro's gaze held hers, an unspoken burden reflected in the depths of his dark eyes, a testament to the heavy truths he was about to unleash. The air, already thick with the scent of stale concrete and the lingering metallic tang of desperation, seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on Sophia, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She watched him, frozen, every nerve ending, screaming in silent anticipation, her own heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. He closed his eyes for a fleeting second, a tremor passing through his jaw, then opened them again, fixed on her, as if drawing strength, or perhaps seeking absolution from her bewildered expression. The words, when they finally came, were a rasp, barely above a whisper, yet they struck her with the force of a physical blow. The statement hung in the suffocating quiet, a poisoned dart launched straight into the tender, scarred tissue of her oldest wound. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, a strangled sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her mind, already reeling from the raw intensity of their encounter, suddenly felt as though it had been plunged into an icy abyss. The world tilted, the stark reality of the prison cell blurring around the edges, replaced by a flash of vivid, agonizing memory, the screech of tires, the shattered glass, the sickening thud that had echoed through her childhood and haunted her dreams ever since. Her sister, Isabella, vibrant and full of laughter, gone in an instant, taken by a cruel twist of fate, an inexplicable, senseless tragedy. It had always been an accident. That was the truth, the only truth she had ever known, the cold, hard fact that had shaped her entire life. This man, this condemned monster, couldn't possibly be suggesting anything else. Her hands, resting on the cold metal table, clenched into fists, knuckles white. The words burst from her, sharp and desperate, laced with a fierce protectiveness over the carefully constructed narrative of her grief. It had to be an accident. To suggest otherwise, to suggest malice or intent, was to unravel the very fabric of her reality, to expose her most profound loss to an even deeper, more unbearable pain. Her gaze, which had been fixed on his, now darted wildly around the cell, seeking an escape from the suffocating weight of his impending revelation. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were unyielding, the bars impenetrable, and his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, held her captive. Alessandro flinched, a subtle tremor passing through his powerful frame, as if her denial was a physical strike. He swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively, and for a moment Sophia saw not the ruthless crime boss, but a man burdened by an unbearable secret, a man on the precipice of confessing a sin that had festered within him for years. His gaze, once unwavering, now seemed to flicker, struggling to meet hers, before finally settling back, resolute and filled with a profound, aching sorrow that made her stomach churn. The confession hung in the air, a poisonous vapor filling her lungs, stealing her breath. A choice. He had made a choice. The implications of those words, spoken with such wrenching regret, began to unfurl in her mind, a monstrous tapestry woven with threads of suspicion and dread. The pieces of a dark, unspeakable puzzle, fragments she had never even known existed, began to clatter into place, each one a sharp, jagged edge slicing through her carefully constructed world. Isabella's laughter, her bright, innocent smile, now seemed to shatter in the face of this new, terrifying truth. Her sister's death, the bedrock of her sorrow, was not a random act of fate, but the direct consequence of this man's will. A cold dread, more profound than any she had ever known, began to spread through Sophia's chest, seeping into her veins, chilling her to the bone. Her initial shock morphed into a sickening confusion, then a rising tide of horror. Her jaw was slack, her lips parted slightly, but no sound escaped. She could only stare at him, her eyes wide, unblinking, pleading for him to retract the words, to tell her it was a cruel joke, a figment of her own traumatized imagination. But his expression, etched with an almost unbearable torment, told her it was all too real. Sophia listened, mesmerized by the horrifying narrative, her mind racing, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was implying. A deal, a sacrifice, the survival of his family, her innocent sister, caught in the crossfire of his brutal world. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a bitter taste rising in her throat. The casualness with which he spoke of certain events and consequences was chilling, a stark reminder of the value, or lack thereof, that a man like him placed on ordinary lives. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, a tremor that spread through her entire body, making her teeth clatter softly. The agreement, he explained, his voice gaining a painful clarity, involved a specific operation, a message sent to our enemies. It was meant to be swift, precise, a show of force that would deter further aggression. The target was a property, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. There was supposed to be no one there, no innocence. But there was a miscalculation. A terrible, unforgivable miscalculation. His voice cracked, and he had to stop, clearing his throat roughly, his gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond her, lost in the torment of his memory. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trapped in a cage. The pieces were, indeed, falling, each one a shard of glass. The warehouse, the outskirts of the city. Isabella had been running an errand for their mother that day, delivering a package to a small, obscure workshop near the old industrial zone, a place they rarely visited. A cold knot formed in her stomach, tightening. With each word, each dawning realization, it wasn't an accident. It was a consequence, a ripple effect from a choice made by this man, a choice that had reverberated through their lives and torn her family apart. The horror of it was suffocating, a black shroud descending over her senses. She could feel the blood draining from her face, leaving her skin clammy and cold. His confession, delivered with a raw, agonizing honesty that pierced through her anger, was a deluge, drowning her in a sea of unspeakable grief and betrayal. Isabella, not an accident, not a cruel twist of fate, but a direct, albeit indirect, consequence of a mafia boss's bloody calculus. Her sister, reduced to a collateral casualty, a footnote in some gang war. The thought was so grotesque, so deeply offensive, that a guttural sound, a strangled cry of pure agony, escaped Sophia's lips. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in her eyes, blurring her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not in front of him. She needed to understand, to grasp every agonizing detail of this monstrous revelation. Her mind screamed for justice, for retribution, for the years of pain and unanswered questions that had suddenly, horrifyingly, found their source in the man sitting across from her. The image of Isabella, vibrant and alive, flashed before her eyes, then fractured into 1,000 pieces, replaced by the gruesome vision of shattered glass and mangled metal, now imbued with a new, terrifying significance. The accident, the one she had replayed 1,000,000 times in her head, was suddenly a carefully constructed lie, a dark secret buried beneath layers of power and corruption. Her entire understanding of her past, of her sister's death, of the world itself, had been irrevocably shattered. A cold fury began to simmer beneath the surface of her shock, a dangerous heat, threatening to consume her. She wanted to scream, to rage, to tear at the bars of this cage, and demand answers, demand justice for the innocent life he had so carelessly, so indirectly snuffed out. Before she could form another word, before the torrent of questions and accusations could spill, from her trembling lips, a sharp, authoritative rap echoed against the heavy steel door of the cell. Both Alessandro and Sophia flinched, startled, their heads snapping towards the sound. The door swung open with a harsh groan, revealing the grim, unyielding face of a prison guard. His uniform was starched, his posture rigid, his eyes devoid of any emotion as they swept over the two figures at the table. The words were a brutal, jarring intrusion, ripping Sophia from the abyss of Alessandro's confession, pulling her back to the harsh reality of their surroundings. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to process a truth that had just ripped her world apart. 5 minutes to confront the man who held the key to her sister's fate. 5 minutes before he was taken away, perhaps forever. The urgency in the guard's tone, the stark finality of his presence, intensified the suffocating tension in the cell to an almost unbearable degree. The confession, the raw, agonizing truth, hung suspended, unfinished, a cruel, dangling thread in the face of imminent separation. The confession, the raw, agonizing truth, hung suspended, unfinished, a cruel, dangling thread in the face of imminent separation. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, a choked gasp that was lost in the sudden, sharp clang of the guard's footsteps retreating from the cell door. 5 minutes. It wasn't nearly enough. It was an insult, a sick, twisted joke played by a merciless clock and a system. designed to crush the human spirit. Her mind, already reeling from the revelation of her sister's fate, now felt like a storm-tossed sea, waves of disbelief crashing against the shore of a horrifying reality. Alessandro had killed her sister. Not directly, perhaps, but his actions, his twisted sense of loyalty, had set in motion a chain of events that had led to that unspeakable tragedy. The realization was a physical blow, a punch to her gut that stole what little air remained in her lungs. She stared at him, her eyes wide and burning, the cold fury that had been simmering now threatening to erupt into an inferno. Every fiber of her being screamed for answers, for justice, for a reckoning that felt impossibly out of reach. Alessandro, his face a mask of desperate urgency, leaned forward, his voice a hoarse whisper, as if he feared the very walls might listen, might steal the last vestiges of his truth. He knew the clock was ticking, each second a precious, fleeting commodity he could never reclaim. He had to deliver. The rest of it, the intricate, agonizing details that had festered within him for so long, burning a hole through his soul. His hands, still resting on the cold metal table, trembled visibly, betraying the immense strain he was under. He was incriminating himself further with every word, painting a picture of complicity and manipulation that would surely seal his fate. Yet there was a strange, almost desperate hunger in his eyes, a need to unburden, to absolve his conscience of the crushing weight it had carried for years, even if it meant confirming his own damnation. He looked at Sophia, his gaze pleading, searching for an understanding she was nowhere near capable of giving. The lines of his face seemed to deepen, etched by years of silent torment, now exposed under the harsh, fluorescent light of the cell. He spoke quickly, words tumbling out in a rush, a fragmented mosaic of half-truths and agonizing admissions. Sophia slammed her palm onto the table, the sharp crack echoing in the small, confined space. Her jaw was clenched so tight she thought her teeth might shatter. Her shock had curdled into a potent cocktail of rage and a fresh, agonizing pain that sliced through her heart. The pain of betrayal, of an innocence shattered, of a life stolen, and of the realization that the man she had once admired, even loved in a different context, was a monster draped in silk. Her chest heaved, struggling to draw a full breath. She pushed back from the table, rising to her feet, her chair scraping loudly across the concrete floor. She towered over him, her voice a guttural growl, raw with the grief and anger that threatened to consume her. "No time," she spat, the words dripping with venom. "There's no time for your lies, Alessandro. He's lying. What did you do, Alessandro? Tell me, what did you do to her?" Her voice cracked on. The last word, a fragile veneer of composure, shattering completely. The tears she had held back, the ones that had pooled behind her eyes like a suffocating lake, now burst forth, hot and furious, streaming down her face, blurring her vision. She felt a primal scream bubbling up from deep within. Her, a desperate wail for the sister she had lost, for the truth that felt like a burning ember in her hand. The injustice of it all, the sheer, unimaginable cruelty threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to shake him, to force the answers from his lips, to make him feel a fraction of the agony she was enduring. DeLuca, who had been a silent, almost spectral presence up until this point, remained seated, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on Alessandro. He had listened with an almost clinical detachment, his skepticism a protective shield around his professional duty. He had seen countless men on the eve of their execution, heard 1,000 desperate pleas, 1,000,000 fabricated confessions, but there was something in Alessandro's frenzied urgency, in the raw, unvarnished pain in Sophia's voice that had begun to chip away at his hardened resolve. A flicker of doubt, a shadow of unease, now danced in his dark eyes. He was a man of the law, bound by facts, by evidence, by the cold, hard letter of the truth. Yet the emotional charge in the room was undeniable, palpable, a current that seemed to bypass his logical defenses. He shifted in his seat, the subtle movement betraying a growing perturbation. He was torn, caught between his ingrained duty to dismiss the ramblings of a condemned man and the shocking implications of Alessandro's words, implications that resonated with a disquieting ring of authenticity. He had dismissed mafia bosses as master manipulators, always playing their own game, but the raw desperation in Alessandro's eyes felt too genuine to be a performance, too close to the precipice of death to be a mere charade. He remained silent, observing, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of this bizarre, unfolding drama. Alessandro flinched at Sophia's outburst, his gaze dropping to the table, then lifting again, meeting her furious eyes with a haunted desperation. He knew she wouldn't understand. Not yet. But he had to try. He had to make her see the impossible choices he believed he had faced, the intricate web of loyalties and threats that had ensnared him. He was a man of power, a boss, yet in that moment he felt utterly powerless, stripped bare before the two people who held the remnants of his legacy, and his judgment in their hands. The weight of his confession, of the choices he had made, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice a strained rasp. I had no choice, Sophia. Not back then, he pleaded, his voice cracking with an emotion that sounded eerily close to genuine remorse. He reached out, a trembling hand, as if to touch her, to convey the depth of his internal struggle. But she recoiled sharply, her eyes burning daggers into him. He withdrew his hand, his shoulders slumping, a profound weariness settling over him. I did it to protect the future of my family. Not just blood, Sophia. The family, the organization, the entire structure. He paused, taking a ragged breath, the confession tearing at him, each word a shard of glass. There were threats, from within, from outside. A war was brewing, a collapse. Millions of lives, livelihoods dependent on our stability. He was trying to justify, to rationalize, to paint his actions as a necessary evil, a sacrifice for a greater good that was now crumbling around him. He knew it sounded hollow, a desperate plea from a dying man, but it was his truth, twisted, and ugly as it was. Sophia scoffed, a harsh, derisive sound that cut through the silence. Her tears were still falling, but now they were mingled with a fierce indignation. Her own family, shattered, broken, grieving, meant nothing to him. His precious organization had claimed her sister, innocent and undeserving. Her voice, though still choked with sobs, gained a newfound strength, an unwavering resolve. She would not let him escape with such a flimsy justification. She would not allow him to hide behind the vague notion of family when he had annihilated hers. But what about my sister? She cried, her voice rising to a raw, heartbreaking crescendo. What about my family? Did their future mean nothing to you? Was her life just collateral damage in your twisted game of power? She was innocent, Alessandro. She was just a girl, a maid trying to make a living. She had no part in your family. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a devastating indictment of his callous disregard for human life, for the lives of those he deemed expendable. Her hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with the intensity of her fury, her grief, her profound sense of betrayal. She felt a burning desire to lash out, to inflict upon him a fraction of the pain he had caused, to make him truly understand the devastation he had wrought. Alessandro's eyes flickered, a deep, unsettling sadness clouding their depths. He looked away, his gaze sweeping over the sterile cell, avoiding Sophia's accusing stare. The truth, the full, crushing weight of it, felt impossibly heavy on his tongue. He knew his explanation sounded like a cheap excuse, but it was all he had left. His time was running out, a merciless countdown to the end of his existence, and he had to make her understand, not just for her sister, but for the legacy he desperately wanted to protect, a legacy that was not entirely his own. He slowly turned his gaze back to DeLuca, a silent plea passing between them, a desperate recognition of the impossible situation. DeLuca's eyebrows furrowed, his expression shifting from detached skepticism to genuine confusion, then to a dawning, horrifying realization. He had always taken the official narrative at face value. Alessandro Moretti, the ruthless boss, caught in his own web of violence, finally brought to justice. But what if it was a carefully constructed lie? What if the man before him was not just a criminal but a pawn? The implications were staggering, threatening to unravel not just this specific case, but potentially a much larger, more intricate conspiracy that reached far beyond the confines of this prison cell. He leaned forward, his professional curiosity now fully engaged, battling against the instinct to dismiss this as a last-ditch effort for clemency. Alessandro's gaze snapped back to Sophia, a desperate plea in his eyes. Someone unexpected, Sophia. Someone no one would ever suspect. Someone with more to lose than just their freedom. Someone who represents a different kind of future for our world. He didn't elaborate the words, hanging like a shroud over an untold story. Or perhaps he corrected himself, his voice growing fainter, his energy visibly draining. A plan, a much larger plan, one that would have shattered everything, a fragile piece, a delicate balance. Her death was a consequence, an unintended one, but a necessary one, in the eyes of those who pull the strings. And I chose to take the fall, to allow the lie to solidify, to preserve that greater, terrible order. He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of his confession almost physically crushing him. I buried the truth so deep, not even the grave could find it. Until now, the silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by Sophia's ragged breathing and the faint, incessant hum of the prison. The air in the cell grew heavy, thick with the scent of old fear and newly unearthed secrets. Sophia stared at Alessandro, her mind racing, trying to process the enormity of what he was implying. An unexpected protector? A larger plan? It sounded like a conspiracy. Theory, a desperate fabrication. Yet the raw pain in his eyes, the urgency in his voice suggested a terrible authenticity. Her initial rage, though still present, was now laced with a chilling confusion. Her sister's death was not just a consequence of a Mafia hit, but a sacrifice in a grander, more terrifying scheme she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Before Sophia could formulate another question, before DeLuca could press for more details, the heavy steel door creaked open once more. The same grim-faced guard stood there, his presence a stark reminder of the rapidly dwindling time. He didn't speak, but his eyes, cold and unwavering, conveyed a message that needed no words. Time was up. Alessandro's last moments were upon him. The guard took a step into the cell, his hand already reaching for Alessandro's arm, a silent command for him to rise. Alessandro flinched, his eyes wide with a sudden, renewed panic. He knew this was it, his final chance. He had to give them something concrete, something undeniable. He couldn't leave Sophia with just fragmented pleas and cryptic pronouncements. His gaze locked onto Sophia's, a silent promise, a desperate plea for her to understand, to believe. With a last, incredible surge of strength, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn prison jacket, his fingers fumbling with a hidden seam. He ripped it open with a desperate tear, revealing a small, folded piece of paper tucked within the lining. His movements were quick, frantic, fueled by the adrenaline of a man facing his final curtain. The guard, startled by the sudden action, hesitated for a split second, his hand hovering uncertain. It was all Alessandro needed. He thrust the paper into Sophia's hand, his fingers brushing. Hers, a fleeting, charged contact that felt like an electric shock. "Find the vault," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, his eyes blazing with an intensity that belied his physical exhaustion. "Under the old olive tree. The one by the river. It's all there. The truth. The real truth. Tell them. Tell them I died for nothing." But she didn't. He squeezed her hand. A final, desperate grip, his eyes pleading for understanding, for action. Just as the guard's hand clamped down on his arm, pulling him roughly to his feet, Alessandro uttered one last, almost inaudible word, a name that hung in the air, pregnant with meaning, before he was yanked away, stumbling toward the door. The sound of his heavy, shuffling footsteps faded quickly down the corridor, leaving Sophia alone, clutching the folded paper, the name echoing in her ears, the weight of his unfinished confession pressing down on her like a tombstone. The name Alessandro had whispered, a ghost of a sound, hung in the cold, stale air of the visitation room, an unbearable echo in Sophia's ears. It was a name she knew, a name that struck a chord of ice in her blood, making her breath catch in her throat. Her fingers, still tingling from his desperate touch, clutched the folded paper as if it were the last anchor in a world suddenly spinning out of control. The guard's rough handling of Alessandro, the swift, unceremonious yank that had pulled him from her sight, left a void, a chilling silence that pressed in on her from all sides. The heavy, shuffling footsteps had quickly faded, swallowed by the stone corridors, leaving behind only the lingering scent of prison and a suffocating sense of finality. Sophia stood there, frozen, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the closed door through which he had been dragged. Her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts, each one tearing at her, threatening to rip apart the very fabric of her understanding. He had said he didn't kill that man. He had said he did it for her. The words hammered against the inside of her skull, a relentless, deafening rhythm. Her hand, trembling uncontrollably, tightened around the paper, crinkling the worn edges. What secrets did it hold? What impossible truth could possibly reside within these fragile folds? Every instinct screamed at her to open it, to know, but a deeper, more primal fear held her captive, terrified of what the revelation might do to her, to the carefully constructed edifice of her hatred and grief. DeLuca, who had watched the entire exchange with a growing sense of bewildered apprehension, now stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief. He had seen the desperation in Alessandro's eyes, the raw urgency of his final act. He had heard the whispered plea about a vault, an olive tree, and a truth that promised to unravel everything. "Sophia," he said, his voice low, a strained whisper. In the sudden emptiness of the room, he reached out, his hand hovering near hers, not daring to touch the paper she held so protectively. "What was that? What did he give you? And what did he mean, the truth?" Sophia finally tore her gaze from the door, turning slowly to face DeLuca. Her eyes, usually so fierce and resolute, were now clouded with a profound confusion, a nascent terror. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The name Alessandro had spoken, the one that resonated with such chilling familiarity, still echoed, demanding recognition, demanding understanding. It was impossible, wasn't it? A Don, a ruthless Mafia boss, sacrificing himself for her? It was a story too outlandish, too melodramatic, too utterly unbelievable for a man like Alessandro Moretti. Yet the conviction in his gaze, the frantic desperation of his last moments, had been undeniably real. When he said he didn't do it, Sophia managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper, ragged with the effort of speaking. Her gaze dropped to the crumpled paper in her hand, as if it held the answers to a riddle she was only just beginning to comprehend. He said he took the blame to protect me. The words sounded foreign even to her own ears, a betrayal of every belief she had held, every accusation she had hurled. The anger that had fueled her for so long, the righteous fury that had been her shield and her sword, suddenly felt brittle, fragile, threatening to shatter. DeLuca recoiled slightly, his jaw clenching. He had spent years pursuing men like Alessandro, building cases, ensuring justice was served. The thought of a man confessing to a crime he didn't commit, especially one of Alessandro's stature, was not just preposterous, it was an affront to everything he believed in. He's lying, Sophia, DeLuca insisted, his voice hardening, trying to inject a sense of rational disbelief into the burgeoning chaos. He's a mafia boss. He's manipulative. He's trying to play you, to sow doubt, to escape his fate. It's an old trick, a desperate ploy from a desperate man. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his expression grim. He wants you to believe he's some kind of martyr, a hero. Don't fall for it. But Sophia shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her dust-streaked cheek. No, she whispered, her conviction growing, even as her heart ached with the painful realization. No, you didn't see his eyes. He wasn't lying. He was desperate. He said, the truth about your sister's death. The mere mention of her sister's name brought a fresh wave of pain, but this time, it was mingled with a chilling new curiosity, a dawning horror. Could it be? Could her entire understanding of the past few years, of her sister's tragic end, have been built on a foundation of lies? The crumpled paper felt heavy, burning in her palm. With a sudden, decisive movement, she unfolded it, her fingers fumbling, her eyes scanning the hastily scrawled Italian script. It wasn't a confession, not in the traditional sense. It was a fragment, a piece of a larger puzzle, a cryptic message detailing locations, names, and a single, chilling phrase that confirmed Alessandro's words, a specific rival family, a power play that had gone horribly wrong, and a direct threat to the remaining family members of those caught in the crossfire. Her sister, Isabella, had not been the target, not directly. She had been an unfortunate, unwitting casualty, a pawn sacrificed in a brutal game of territorial expansion and blood feuds. The real target had been Sophia herself, or rather, the very existence of her family, to send a message, to eradicate a lineage that had inadvertently crossed paths with the wrong people. Alessandro, she now understood with a horrifying clarity, had stepped in. He hadn't orchestrated Isabella's death. He had, in fact, absorbed the blame for a crime committed by a rival whose power was so vast, whose reach was so insidious, that exposing them would have meant not just his own death, but the complete annihilation of Sophia and any surviving members of her family. His condemnation had been a strategic sacrifice, a desperate gambit to prevent a far greater, more widespread vengeance from falling upon the one person he had, in his own twisted way, genuinely cared for. He had chosen to be the monster, to let the world believe he was capable of such a heinous act, rather than allow Sophia to become a victim in a war she could not possibly win. The realization hit Sophia with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, catching herself against the cold, unforgiving wall of the cell. Her anger, a fierce, burning flame that had sustained her, now flickered, wavered, and began to transform. It was no longer a simple, pure rage, but something far more complex, far more agonizing. It was a profound, aching understanding of a sacrifice she had never asked for, a burden he had carried in silent, brutal stoicism. The monster she had hated, the man she had despised, had, in a horrifyingly perverse way, been her protector. He had allowed himself to be condemned, to walk to his death, to preserve her life, her very existence. A wave of nausea washed over her. She had wished him dead, had prayed for his execution, believing it would bring her justice, closure. But now, the impending execution felt like an unspeakable tragedy, a final, irreversible injustice. Her fury, so long directed at Alessandro now, twisted into a knot of self-recrimination, a bitter taste of regret. How could she have been so blind? How could she have misunderstood so completely? The weight of his confession, the impossible burden of his love or loyalty, whatever it was that had driven him, was almost unbearable. Her eyes burned, not with tears of sorrow, but with the searing pain of a truth too heavy to carry. Pity, a raw, unwelcome emotion, began to blossom in her chest, intertwining with her lingering resentment, creating a dizzying, agonizing blend of feelings she couldn't reconcile. DeLuca, watching the profound shift in Sophia's expression, the way her body trembled, the almost physical agony radiating from her, felt a cold dread creep into his own heart. He saw the paper, too, the hastily scrawled words that hinted at a truth far more intricate than any official report had dared to suggest. He didn't need to read every line. The raw, gut-wrenching realization on Sophia's face was enough. What does it say? He asked, his voice now laced with a genuine tremor of apprehension. The possibility that the system he served, the justice he upheld, was about to execute. A man who, while a criminal, might be innocent of this specific charge and had made an impossible sacrifice was a horrifying thought. Sophia could only shake her head, clutching the paper to her chest as if it were a fragile bird. He didn't kill him, she whispered again, the words imbued with a new, terrifying certainty. He took the blame. For me. For Isabella. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Alessandro Moretti, the ruthless Don, the man condemned for a heinous murder, was not the cold-blooded killer everyone believed him to be, at least not for this crime. He was still a monster. Yes, a man who had undoubtedly committed countless other atrocities in his life, a leader of a criminal empire. But for this one, the one that had consumed Sophia's life, the one for which he was about to pay the ultimate price, he was a scapegoat, a martyr, a shield. DeLuca's mind reeled. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of justice, on the absolute conviction that the law, while imperfect, was fundamentally sound. But what if it wasn't? What if, in this one instance, the scales had been tipped not by a lie for personal gain, but by a lie for altruistic, albeit twisted, protection? An innocent man, for this particular crime, was minutes away from execution. Yet, could he truly call Alessandro Moretti innocent in the broader sense? He was still a mafia boss, a figurehead of immense evil, responsible for countless deaths and suffering. The moral calculus was dizzying, an impossible equation that threatened to unravel his own sense of duty, his very understanding of right and wrong. The justice he so fiercely believed and suddenly felt. Fragile, tainted, and deeply, profoundly flawed. His skepticism warred with the horrifying evidence of Sophia's transformation, the stark truth etched onto her face. He wanted to shout to dismiss it all, as a final, desperate manipulation. But the raw, unadulterated pain in Sophia's eyes, the profound grief mixed with this new, terrible understanding, silenced him. A sudden, jarring clang echoed down the corridor, growing louder, closer. The rhythmic, heavy thud of multiple footsteps approached the door, each one a hammer blow to the fragile peace of the visitation room. The air grew thick with unspoken dread, with the terrible knowledge that time, that most merciless of adversaries, had finally run out. Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a renewed, frantic desperation. It was a sound she had been anticipating, a sound she had, in her anger, once craved, but now it filled her with a profound and sickening terror. The heavy steel door scraped open, revealing two uniformed guards, their faces impassive, their movements precise and unyielding. They stood framed in the doorway, their presence a stark, brutal reminder of the prison's authority, of the irreversible path Alessandro was about to walk. Their eyes swept over Sofia and Luca, then settled on the empty space where Alessandro had been. One of them stepped forward, his gaze direct, his voice devoid of emotion. "Time's up," he announced, the words cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "Moretti is being prepared. It's time for you both to leave." Sofia felt a guttural scream rising in her throat, a desperate plea to stop, to explain, to undo the irreversible march towards an execution that now felt like a second, unforgivable murder. She clutched the paper tighter, her knuckles white, her body trembling uncontrollably. Luca, his own mind reeling from the moral quagmire he had been plunged into, felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was an officer of the law, a man of order, but the order he served was about to commit an act that now felt profoundly wrong, no matter how many other crimes Alessandro had committed. He looked at Sofia, her face a mask of anguish, then back at the guards, a silent, desperate battle raging within him. But there was nothing he could do, nothing either of them could do. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, were relentless, unfeeling, and utterly unforgiving. Alessandro Moretti, the Don, the monster, the man who had made an impossible sacrifice, was being led to his death, leaving Sofia and Luca in the cold, stark cell, trapped in a maelstrom of unbearable emotions and an unspeakable, earth-shattering truth. The heavy steel door clanged shut with a sound that reverberated through Sofia's bones, a final, metallic echo that sealed away not just Alessandro, but the last vestiges of her comfortable reality. It wasn't a gentle click or a soft thud. It was the brutal, unyielding pronouncement of an ending, a sound that sliced through the air and left a hollow ache in her chest. The click of the lock, sharp and decisive, seemed to sever the very thread connecting her to the man who had just confessed. She stood there, rooted to the spot, the rough edges of the folded paper digging into her palm, a physical manifestation of the impossible truth she now held. Her breath hitched in her throat, a desperate gasp for air that refused to come, leaving her lungs burning. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at the empty space where Alessandro had been, but all she saw was the ghost of his gaze, the raw vulnerability, the profound sorrow, and the impossible sacrifice etched into his final moments. The guards, their faces impassive, gave them one last, dismissive glance before turning and walking away, their footsteps fading down the corridor until only the chilling silence remained. It was a silence that pressed down on Sofia, suffocating her with the weight of Alessandro's confession. She could still feel the tremor in his voice, could still see the desperate plea in his eyes, a plea not for clemency, but for understanding, for the truth to be known. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to scream, to somehow rewind time and prevent this horrific mistake from unfolding. But her feet were cemented to the floor, her limbs heavy, unresponsive. Her mind, usually so sharp and practical, was a chaotic storm of images and fragmented thoughts. The memory of her own pain, her own misguided anger, now replaced by an overwhelming wave of regret and a crushing sense of injustice. He had lied to protect her, to save her, and she, in her ignorance, had condemned him. Further, the thought was a venomous serpent coiling in her gut, tightening its hold until she felt nauseous. Luca, for his part, remained visibly shaken. The rigid certainty that usually defined him had crumbled, leaving behind a man wrestling with a profound internal tremor. He watched the guards disappear, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, his eyes fixed on the now-closed door as if it held the answer to the moral abyss that had just opened beneath his feet. He was a man of logic, of law, of black and white, But Alessandro Moretti had just painted a canvas of shades of gray that threatened to unravel his entire understanding of justice. He turned to Sophia, his gaze desperate, searching for something, anything, to latch onto, to pull himself back from the precipice of doubt. He saw the anguish on her face, the quiet devastation that mirrored the earthquake in his own soul, and a desperate need to rationalize, to contain the chaos, surged within him. Sophia, he began, his voice rough, an octave lower than usual, laced with an urgency he couldn't quite mask. He took a hesitant step towards her, then stopped, as if unsure how close he dared to get to the raw grief radiating from her. You can't believe that." He gestured vaguely, towards the door, then to the paper clutched in her hand. This is a desperate man, Sophia. A cornered animal. He's trying to manipulate you, to twist the narrative in his final moments. It's a classic tactic. His words were an attempt to rebuild the walls, to reassert the order that had been so violently shaken. He needed to believe it, for his own sanity, for the integrity of the system he had dedicated his life to. It doesn't change who he is, Sophia. A murderer, a crime boss, a man responsible for countless atrocities. He emphasized each word, tried to imbue them with enough weight to crush the fragile seed of doubt that Alessandro's confession had planted. He is guilty. He is the monster. This changes nothing. His voice hardened, a strained effort to sound authoritative, to sound convinced. But Sophia, through the haze of her own shock and burgeoning grief, found a new clarity, a sharp, piercing understanding that cut through to Luca's carefully constructed rationalizations. The world had shifted on its axis, and the old arguments, the old certainties, no longer held any sway. She looked at him, her eyes burning with a conviction that startled even herself. The paper in her hand felt not like a burden, but like a sacred trust. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, a small, defiant ripple in the oppressive silence of a cell. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them, her gaze unwavering. "No, you're wrong." Her voice gained strength with each word, fueled by a truth that had just been unveiled in the most brutal, heartbreaking way. He was telling the truth. I know he was. The words were not a plea, but an assertion born from the raw certainty of her gut, from the memory of Alessandro's eyes, which had held no deceit, only the profound pain of a man unburdening his soul. Everything about him in that moment, the way he looked, the things he said, it wasn't an act. It wasn't a manipulation. He was confessing. To protect me. A tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path. Down her cold cheek, a single, solitary river of sorrow. DeLuca recoiled slightly, as if struck. The certainty in her voice, the unshakable conviction, chipped away further at his carefully maintained composure. He wanted to dismiss it, to label it as emotional hysteria, but he had seen Alessandro's face too, had heard the chilling sincerity in his voice. The truth, ugly and inconvenient, was clawing at the edges of his consciousness. "Sophia, listen to yourself," DeLuca pleaded, his voice tinged with a desperation that bordered on anger. He grabbed her arm gently, his touch firm, trying to ground her, to pull her back to what he considered reality. This is exactly what he wants you to think. He's the most dangerous kind of criminal, one who can charm, one who can twist perceptions. He's a maestro of deceit. You cannot let your emotions blind you to who he really is, to what he has done. He tried to steer her gaze back to the cold, hard facts, to the mountains of evidence that had led to Alessandro's conviction. He's a monster. He orchestrated countless murders. He terrorized a city. This specific crime, it's just one of many. It doesn't absolve him. But it's this crime, DeLuca. Sophia cried out, pulling her arm away from his grasp, her voice cracking with the intensity of her emotion. She thrust the crumpled paper, Alessandro's final words, towards him, as if the physical act could transfer the weight of her understanding. He's about to die for this crime, and he didn't do it. He confessed to save my life, to take the blame for something he wasn't responsible for, to ensure I wouldn't be implicated. He sacrificed himself. Don't you see? He didn't kill the mayor. He wouldn't let me pay for it. He knew they would come for me next. Her voice ended on a ragged sob, her chest heaving, the full, devastating weight of Alessandro's love and sacrifice crashing down on her. The image of the car bomb, the mayor's mangled vehicle, the chilling phone call she had received from the anonymous tipster all flashed through her mind. It had been a trap, a setup, and Alessandro, the man she had despised, had walked willingly into the jaws of death to shield her. De Luca stared at the paper in her hand, then at Sophia's tear-streaked face, his own features a mask of agonizing internal conflict. The air in the cell grew heavy, charged with the unbearable tension of their opposing convictions. His mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of legal codes, ethical dilemmas, and deeply ingrained principles. He was a prosecutor, a man who believed in the absolute certainty of justice, in the meticulous process of evidence and verdict. But what if the verdict in this singular, crucial instance was flawed? What if the system, the very bedrock of his professional existence, was about to commit a profound, irreversible error? He paced a few steps, his hands running through his hair, a gesture of profound distress he rarely allowed himself. The silence, broken only by Sophia's shuddering breaths, was deafening. He had built his entire career on bringing men like Alessandro Moretti to justice. He had reveled in the conviction, had seen it as a triumph of order over chaos, of law over lawlessness. But now this whisper of doubt, this impossible, unbearable truth whispered by a condemned man in his final moments, validated by the desperate, clear-eyed conviction of Sophia. The clock was ticking, he knew. The execution protocols, once initiated, were swift, mechanical, unfeeling. Alessandro was being prepared even now, walking his final steps toward the sterile room, towards an end that was meant to be the culmination of a just process. But if he wasn't guilty of this specific crime, then the execution, no matter how many other monstrous deeds Alessandro had committed, would be an unforgivable stain on his conscience, a perversion of the justice he swore to uphold. He looked at Sophia again, her eyes fixed on him, a silent, desperate plea for him to see, to understand. He could dismiss her, attribute her belief to the emotional turmoil of the moment. He could cling to the comfort of the established narrative, to the undeniable fact of Alessandro's overall villainy. It would be easy. It would preserve his career, his reputation, the unwavering faith in the system that had defined his life. He would simply let the machine run its course. Alessandro Moretti was a monster anyway. Society would be safer without him, whether he killed the mayor or not. That was the logical, pragmatic, career-preserving choice. But the image of Alessandro's eyes, the profound sorrow, the impossible sacrifice flickered behind his own. The words, "I did it for her," echoed in the cold chamber of De Luca's mind. He had seen enough desperate men to recognize the truth when it stared him in the face, even if that truth was cloaked in the darkest of circumstances. Alessandro Moretti was a criminal, yes, a deplorable human being, a man whose hands were stained with blood 1,000 times over. But was he a man who would lie about this particular act in his final breath? To protect Sophia, a woman he had clearly, inexplicably loved? The irony was so bitter, so profoundly unsettling. His duty was to the law, to the state, to the victims. His duty was to ensure justice was served. But what kind of justice was it, he agonized, to execute a man for a crime he didn't commit, even if he deserved to die for 100 others? Was it justice, or merely retribution, blind and unthinking? The lines blurred, the solid ground beneath his feet turned to quicksand. His mind replayed the entire interrogation, Alessandro's stoic silence, his refusal to implicate anyone, his sudden, stark confession. It was all so meticulously planned, so chillingly executed. A sacrifice, a grand, tragic gesture from a man who had only ever known how to take. His career, his years of climbing the ladder, the respect he commanded, all of it could be jeopardized, shattered, if he dared to intervene, to question the final verdict. He would be seen as soft, as compromised, as having lost his nerve, or worse, as being somehow entangled with the very criminal he had brought down. The system, once challenged, often devoured its own. He imagined the headlines, the accusations, the inevitable internal investigation that would follow any attempt to halt the execution now. He would be a pariah, his life's work undone. But the alternative, the image of Alessandro, strapped to a gurney, receiving a lethal injection for a crime he didn't commit, while the true culprit walked free. That image was a poison, a slow, agonizing burn in his soul. He had seen the corruption in the underworld, had fought against it his entire life. But what if the corruption had seeped into the very halls of justice, if a grand lie was about to be officially sanctioned? Could he live with that? Could he truly uphold the law if he allowed such a perversion to stand? He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing moment, the weight of the decision a crushing burden on his shoulders. The cold air of the cell seemed to seep into his very bones, chilling him to the core. Sophia's gaze was a physical pressure, a silent accusation, a desperate plea. The ghost of Alessandro's sacrifice, a silent testament to a twisted form of love, haunted him. Duty, morality, consequences, three immovable forces colliding within him, tearing him apart. His resolve, once so unyielding, wavered, then cracked. The law, he realized, was not just about conviction. It was about truth. And the truth, as messy and inconvenient as it was, had just presented itself in the most undeniable, gut-wrenching way. The implications of Alessandro's confession, if true, were monumental not just for the deceased crime boss, but for the integrity of the entire justice system. He had to act. He had to. A desperate, last-minute decision solidified in his mind, born not of legal precedent or strategic calculation, but from a raw, visceral moral imperative that transcended his training, his career, his very understanding of order. He looked at Sophia, his face grim, eyes now alight with a fierce, almost reckless determination. The time was not just running out for Alessandro, it was running out for Luca's own soul. He had to try. He had to gamble everything. He had to shatter the rigid structure he had built his life upon. He turned abruptly, his movements sharp, decisive, a man possessed by a sudden, impossible conviction. The cell door, which had seemed to seal away all hope, now represented the last barrier between a potential injustice and a desperate, unforeseen intervention. He had to get out, he had to move, and he had to do it now, before the cold wheels of justice ground Alessandro Moretti into dust, taking a piece of De Luca's own conscience with him. De Luca burst from the cell, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him with a resonant clang that echoed through the sterile corridor. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat, urging him forward. He didn't pause, didn't look back at Sophia, who he knew would be left in a whirlwind of shock and a terrifying, fragile hope. There was no time for explanations, no moment for comfort. Every second was a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass of Alessandro Rossi's life. He moved with a speed he hadn't known he possessed, his polished shoes skidding slightly on the wax floor, the sound of frantic counterpoint to the thundering silence of his own desperate resolve. Guards and prison staff, startled by his sudden, uncharacteristic sprint, turned to stare, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the distant exit sign, a beacon in the labyrinthine corridors of the maximum security facility. The air, usually thick with the scent of disinfectant and stale fear, now seemed charged with an electric tension, mirroring the chaos in his own mind. He reached the main administrative block, pushing past a bewildered secretary, his voice raw, hoarse from the adrenaline coursing through him. "Where is the execution chamber?" he demanded, his eyes wide, darting around the reception area. The woman, a seasoned veteran of prison bureaucracy, merely blinked, her face a mask of practiced indifference. "Sir, you know protocol." "No, one is permitted." DeLuca cut her off, his hand slamming down on her desk, rattling a stack of neatly organized files. "There's no protocol when a life hangs by a thread. Tell me now." His urgency, the sheer, unhinged desperation in his tone, finally pierced through her professional facade. She stammered, pointing a trembling finger down a dimly lit hallway. "Third floor, sir." "But it's already." He was already gone, scaling the 2 flights of stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning, the muscles in his legs screaming in protest. The image of Alessandro, his face etched with a lifetime of regret, his voice surprisingly clear as he recounted the terrible truth, replayed in his mind. The weight of that confession, a confession that could shake the very foundations of the justice system, pressed down onto Luca, fueling his impossible race. He burst onto the 3rd floor landing, the air growing colder, heavier, saturated with a grim finality. 2 uniformed guards stood before a reinforced steel door, their faces set, their posture rigid. One held a clipboard, his finger tracing a line down a document. The other stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a silent sentinel of death. A chilling, metallic thud resonated from within the chamber, a sound that spoke of machinery engaging, of mechanisms of death clicking into place. DeLuca's blood ran cold. He pictured the sterile room, the gurney, the 4 lines, the faces of the witnesses behind the thick glass. Was he too late? Had his conscience awakened only to witness the final, agonizing breath of a man he could have saved? He slammed his fist against the door, the impact reverberating painfully up his arm. "Open this door. Now, I have a sworn confession. A miscarriage of justice is about to occur." His voice rose to a roar, desperate, pleading, a man on the precipice of an unimaginable failure. The guards, now exchanging bewildered glances, hesitated. The sheer force of DeLuca's conviction, the raw, unbridled authority in his voice, despite his disheveled appearance and frantic state, gave them pause. Inside the execution chamber, Alessandro Rossi lay strapped to the gurney, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He had accepted his fate, finding a strange peace in the finality, a morbid redemption in his last act of truth. The warden, a stern, unyielding man, stood by the red phone, his hand hovering over the receiver, waiting for the final, official word. The executioner, unseen behind a frosted glass panel, prepared the lethal injection. A profound silence had descended upon the room, broken only by the soft hum of the ventilation system and Alessandro's slow, steady breaths. He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips, imagining Sophia, free from the burden of his secret, free to live. He could almost hear the distant, muffled cries, but dismissed them as mere echoes of his own fading consciousness. Then, a sudden, violent banging on the chamber door, accompanied by a frantic, shouting voice, pierced through the solemn stillness. "Parem a execução. Temos novas evidências." The words were muffled, distorted, but the urgency was undeniable. The warden's hand, which had been about to give the signal, froze. His eyes, usually impassive, widened slightly. The witnesses stirred, a ripple of confused murmurs spreading through the observation room. Alessandro's eyes snapped open. He heard his name, then Sophia's, in the desperate, muffled voice from beyond the door. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope? Fear? ignited in his chest, hot and unexpected. It was a cruel twist, a last-second reprieve that felt more like a torment. He had made his peace. He had confessed. Why was this happening now? Outside, DeLuca was a force of nature. He had pushed one guard aside. The other was on the phone, his voice a frantic whisper. "Get the warden on the line. Tell him to hold. Prosecutor DeLuca is here. He has a confession." The reinforced door finally hissed open, revealing the stunned faces of the execution team. "Stop!" DeLuca yelled again, stepping into the frigid room, his eyes instantly locking onto Alessandro on the gurney. "Stop the execution. He is innocent of the crime he confessed to. I have his full, sworn statement detailing the true perpetrator." His words hung in the air, cold and shocking, shattering the solemn pretense of justice. The executioner, syringe poised, hesitated. The warden, pale-faced, stared at DeLuca, then at Alessandro. The red phone, still clutched in his hand, remained silent. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity, a maelstrom of legalities and moral quandaries. Orders were shouted, phones rang, and DeLuca, seizing the moment, presented a hastily scrawled, yet legally sound, affidavit signed by Alessandro. The execution was officially halted, a stay, granted in the final, agonizing seconds. The 4 lines were removed, the straps unbuckled, but Alessandro remained on the gurney, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He was alive. He was still alive. The reality was a punch to the gut, a confusing mix of relief and a profound sense of disruption. His carefully constructed exit, his last act of defiance and love, had been snatched away. He looked at DeLuca, the prosecutor's face grim, sweat-streaked, but alight with an almost feverish triumph. This man, his antagonist, had saved him. Back in the visitor's cell, Sophia sat in stunned silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. The door had closed onto Luca's frantic exit, leaving her in a vacuum of uncertainty. She had heard the distant shouts, the frantic footsteps, the palpable shift in the prison's oppressive atmosphere. She knew instinctively that something monumental had just occurred. Her mind replayed Alessandro's words, his confession, the names he had uttered, the terrible, beautiful sacrifice he had been willing to make. The weight of it settled upon her, heavy and cold. He had done it. For her. For her. The silent thought echoed in the chambers of her heart, a realization that was both devastating and profoundly moving. Her life, already scarred by the shadows of the past, was now irrevocably altered. The truth, raw and brutal, was a new burden, a new freedom. She remembered the little girl, orphaned and adrift, taken, and by a man who was both monster and savior. She remembered the years of silence, the unspoken horrors, the desperate need for escape. And now this, Alessandro, the notorious crime boss, had offered her not just a confession, but a shield, a final act of protection against a world that had always been cruel to her. He had offered his life, his freedom, his reputation, all for her quiet peace. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. Her tears, when they finally came, were not of sadness, but of a complex, overwhelming grief for the past, for the choices made, for the innocent lives lost, and for the man who had, in his own twisted way, loved her enough to confess to a crime he did not commit so that she might finally be free. The next few days blurred into an exhausting whirlwind of interrogations, legal proceedings, and media frenzy. DeLuca, hailed by some as a hero and condemned by others as a maverick who had subverted due process, found himself at the epicenter of a firestorm. His career, once a meticulously crafted edifice of legal precision, was now a precarious structure swaying in the winds of public opinion and judicial scrutiny. The justice system, rigid and unyielding, was not designed for such dramatic, last-minute revelations. An internal investigation was immediately launched into his conduct questioning his judgment, his ethics, even his sanity. He stood firm, however, his conviction unshaken. The truth, however inconvenient, was paramount. He had acted not as a prosecutor, but as a man burdened by a moral imperative, and he would face the consequences with the same grim resolve that had propelled him down that prison corridor. Alessandro Rossi, no longer facing the death penalty for that specific murder, was now the central figure in a new, even more complex legal saga. His detailed confession, outlining the real killer and the true motives behind the gangland hit, implicated powerful figures, not just within his own fractured organization, but reaching into the very fabric of the city's corrupt underworld. The old crime boss, granted a stay of execution, was now a protected witness, a man whose life, though spared, was now perhaps more imperiled than ever. His testimony, if given, would unleash a torrent of retribution, a bloody reckoning that would shake the city to its core. His future, once neatly sealed by a death sentence, was now a tangled web of dangerous possibilities. For Sophia, the world had shifted on its axis. She was no longer just a former maid, the forgotten witness. She was the catalyst, the recipient of a dying man's desperate truth, a truth that had ripped open old wounds and forced her to confront a past she had painstakingly buried. The media, vultures sensing a story, hounded her, their cameras flashing, their questions intrusive and relentless. She found solace only in the quiet corners of her mind, replaying Alessandro's words, trying to decipher the true meaning of his sacrifice. Was it redemption, a final act of love, or merely another manipulation from a man who had known no other way? She left the city, seeking refuge in a small, anonymous town far from the echoes of her former life. The money Alessandro had left her, untouched for years, now represented a chance, a blank slate. She started over, slowly, cautiously, carrying the weight of his confession like a secret burden, a complex legacy. The persistent uncertainty about Alessandro's ultimate fate, whether he would ever truly find freedom, or if the system would simply find another way to exact its pound of flesh, lingered like a shadow. DeLuca's career was ultimately transformed, not ended. The internal investigation concluded with a reprimand, but also an acknowledgement of the critical evidence he had uncovered. He became a different kind of prosecutor, one less bound by rigid adherence to the letter of the law and more attuned to its spirit, its capacity for uncovering deeper, more nuanced truths. His actions had indeed rocked the system, forcing uncomfortable questions about the infallibility of justice, the pressure of deadlines, and the human element that, for better or worse, always played a part. He never saw Sophia again, but her face and Alessandro's dying plea remained etched in his memory, a constant reminder of the day he chose conscience over career and gambled everything on a flicker of truth. The story of Alessandro Rossi, the Mafia boss whose last wish saved his life, became a legend. Whispered in the shadows, a cautionary tale, and a testament to the unpredictable currents of fate. His life, irrevocably changed, became a living paradox, a man condemned to die, saved by a confession meant to set another free, only to face a new kind of imprisonment, a new kind of danger. Justice in the end was not a clean, surgical cut, but a messy, evolving process full of unexpected turns and moral ambiguities. And Sophia, the quiet woman whose life had been a pawn in a larger, darker game, walked away with a fragile peace, a heavy heart, and the profound, enduring knowledge that even in the darkest corners of the human soul, love, however distorted, could compel an act of unimaginable sacrifice. Her journey was just beginning, a new path forged from the ashes of a past she could never fully escape, but one she could now, finally, confront on her own terms. The lingering question, however, remained. Had Alessandro truly found redemption, or had he merely traded one prison for another, his last wish echoing through the corridors of time as a final, desperate gamble, whose true cost was yet to be fully paid? The answer, like so much else in this complex tapestry of crime and consequence, was left to the quiet, unsettling judgment of history.